Picture this: my sister Valentina stood on the deck of the USS Constellation, surrounded by 3,000 sailors, as Admiral Harrison Blackwood's voice cut through the South China Sea wind like a blade. "Lieutenant Reeves, you are hereby stripped of your flight deck certification and relieved of duty effective immediately." The entire carrier went silent. You could hear the ocean waves against the hull, the distant hum of jet engines, and probably every heartbeat on that deck. But here's what nobody expected. What happened next with just one hand signal from my sister changed everything the Navy thought they knew about her, about leadership, and about what it really means to serve your country. I'm Maya Reeves, and I was there that day, watching from the communications tower as my younger sister faced the biggest humiliation of her military career. Valentina had always been the golden child in our family, the one who excelled at everything she touched. At 28, she was already one of the most respected flight deck officers in the Pacific Fleet, managing aircraft launches and recoveries on one of the most dangerous pieces of real estate in the world, an active carrier deck. Admiral Harrison Blackwood was old-school Navy, 55 years old with 3 decades of service under his belt. He believed in rigid hierarchy, unquestioned orders, and the kind of military discipline that built the Navy's reputation. He saw my sister's questions and safety concerns as nothing more than insubordination from a junior officer who didn't know her place. Commander Zara Mitchell had been Valentina's mentor since she first stepped foot on the Constellation 3 years earlier. At 35, Mitchell was caught in an impossible position, torn between her loyalty to the young officer she'd trained and groomed for leadership, and her duty to support the chain of command, even when she disagreed with it. As I watched this scene unfold from my intelligence station high above the flight deck, I saw something in Valentina's eyes that took me back to when we were kids. It wasn't defeat, wasn't shame, wasn't even anger. It was the same look she had when our dad told her she'd never be strong enough to make it through Navy flight training. The same quiet determination that had carried her through every challenge in her life. What none of us knew in that moment was that, in less than 10 minutes, those same eyes would be calculating wind speed, deck movement, and launch angles under conditions that would test every skill she'd ever learned. What we couldn't have imagined was that the very integrity that got her publicly humiliated would make her the only person on that ship capable of saving 4 lives. To understand what happened that day, you need to know who Valentina really was before everything changed. We grew up as Navy brats, moving from base to base, but while most military kids complain about the constant relocations, Valentina thrived on it. She collected challenge coins from every base we lived on, memorized aircraft specifications like other kids memorized baseball stats, and spent hours watching flight operations whenever Dad would take us to the airfield. When we turned 18, we both knew we'd serve, but our paths diverged completely. I went into naval intelligence, drawn to the puzzle-solving aspects of gathering and analyzing information. Valentina went straight for aviation, but not as a pilot like everyone expected. She wanted to be on the flight deck, coordinating the choreographed chaos that happens every single day on a carrier. "Pilots get all the glory," she told me during her training, "but flight deck officers keep everyone alive." For 3 years aboard the Constellation, she proved that philosophy right. Over 2,000 successful aircraft launches and recoveries without a single safety incident. In the Navy, that kind of record doesn't just happen by accident. It happens because someone is paying attention to every detail, every weather change, every mechanical issue, every human factor that could turn routine operations deadly. The morning this all started, we were on day 4 of what the Navy called critical training exercises in the South China Sea. What that really meant was that every ship in our battle group was being evaluated by admirals and Pentagon officials who would determine funding, promotions, and the future of entire commands. The pressure was crushing everyone from the lowest-ranking sailor to the ship's captain. Valentina had been pulling 16-hour shifts, managing flight operations that were more complex than anything I'd seen in my 5 years of service. We were launching and recovering aircraft around the clock, coordinating with destroyers, submarines, and supply ships spread across hundreds of miles of ocean. Every operation had to be perfect, every timeline had to be met, and every metric had to exceed the previous year's performance. But here's where things started going wrong. The impossible schedule was forcing shortcuts that made Valentina's skin crawl. Maintenance checks that normally took 2 hours were being compressed into 30 minutes. Weather briefings that should have been detailed analyses were becoming quick radio calls. Pre-flight safety inspections were being rushed to keep the timeline on track. I started noticing the changes in her during our brief conversations in the mess hall. Dark circles under her eyes that went deeper than just fatigue. A tension in her shoulders that never seemed to relax, even during her few hours of downtime. She'd always been meticulous, but now she was double and triple checking everything because she couldn't trust the systems around her to maintain their usual standards. "Maya, they're cutting corners everywhere," she confided in me 3 nights before the incident. "Yesterday, maintenance signed off on an aircraft that I personally saw leaking hydraulic fluid. When I questioned it, they said it was within acceptable parameters. Since when is any hydraulic leak acceptable on a $60 million fighter jet?" That was Valentina's fatal flaw, and her greatest strength rolled into one. She couldn't stay quiet when she saw something wrong. Our dad used to watch her challenge teachers, coaches, and even commanding officers when she was still a midshipman. "That girl's integrity is going to either make her a hero or get her kicked out of the service," he'd say, shaking his head with a mixture of pride and worry. She'd already spoken up twice during the exercises about safety concerns, earning stern warnings from her immediate supervisors. Commander Mitchell tried to protect her, explaining to the chain of command that Valentina's concerns were legitimate and came from a place of genuine care for crew safety. But Admiral Blackwood saw it differently. To him, questioning orders was questioning authority, and in his Navy, that was unacceptable regardless of the underlying reasons. The morning of Day 5 started like any other, with the pre-dawn launch of reconnaissance aircraft and the steady rhythm of flight operations that had become second nature to everyone on the constellation. From my intelligence station, I watched Valentina move across the flight deck with her usual precision, coordinating the intricate dance of aircraft, crew, and equipment that most people can't even comprehend. At 8:47 hours, everything changed. The aircraft in question was an FA-18 Super Hornet, tail number 307, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Jake Torres, a veteran with over 1,200 flight hours who'd served 2 combat deployments. As the jet moved into position for launch, Valentina conducted her routine visual inspection from the flight deck control station. What she saw made her blood run cold. Hydraulic fluid was dripping from the aircraft's main landing gear assembly, creating a small but steady puddle on the deck. In normal circumstances, this would be an automatic grounding situation. No exceptions, no discussions, no shortcuts. Hydraulic systems control everything from landing gear operation to flight control surfaces. A failure at takeoff speed could be catastrophic. Valentina immediately radioed maintenance control. "Deck control to maintenance. We have a hydraulic leak on aircraft 307. Request immediate inspection and grounding until repairs are completed." The response came back within seconds. "Maintenance to deck control. That aircraft was signed off as mission-ready 30 minutes ago. Leak is within acceptable parameters for flight operations." But Valentina had been doing this job for 3 years. She'd seen what acceptable parameters looked like, and this wasn't it. The leak was getting worse, not better, and launching that aircraft would put Torres at serious risk. She keyed her radio again, this time addressing Admiral Blackwood directly in the ship's command center. "Admiral, this is Lieutenant Reeves on the flight deck. I'm requesting permission to ground aircraft 307 due to hydraulic system malfunction." The radio crackled with silence for nearly 10 seconds. When Blackwood's voice came back, it was sharp and final. "Lieutenant Reeves, that aircraft has been cleared for launch by qualified maintenance personnel. You have your orders. Launch that bird immediately." Every person on that flight deck heard the exchange. 60 pairs of eyes turned toward Valentina as she stood at her control station, weighing her options. I could see her face from my position in the tower, see the conflict written across her features. Follow orders and potentially send a pilot to his death, or refuse and face the consequences of disobeying a direct order from an admiral. "Sir, I cannot in good conscience authorize a launch that puts our pilot at risk," she responded, her voice steady but firm. The effect was immediate and electric. Flight deck operations don't just pause, they freeze. Aircraft engines kept running, but every crew member stopped what they were doing. Even Torres, sitting in his cockpit ready for launch, could hear the radio traffic and understood exactly what was happening. Admiral Blackwood's response echoed across the entire ship's communication system. "Lieutenant Reeves, you have directly disobeyed a direct order from a superior officer. Stand down immediately." "Admiral, with respect, safety protocols clearly state that any aircraft showing signs of hydraulic malfunction must be grounded pending inspection. I cannot authorize this launch." What happened next was something I'd never seen in 5 years of naval service. Admiral Blackwood left the command center and personally walked onto the flight deck, his face red with anger, his stride purposeful and intimidating. Every sailor, airman, and officer on that deck came to attention as he approached Valentina's position. "Lieutenant Reeves," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the deck despite the wind and engine noise, "you have repeatedly demonstrated insubordination and failure to follow direct orders. You are hereby stripped of your flight deck certification and relieved of duty effective immediately. Master at arms, escort this officer below deck." The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, Torres made his own decision. He shut down his aircraft's engines, removed his helmet, and shook his head, understanding completely what had just transpired. A pilot had just watched an officer sacrifice her career to potentially save his life. For exactly 97 seconds, the USS Constellation experienced something that rarely happens on a military vessel. Complete, absolute silence except for the wind and waves. Valentina stood at attention, flanked by 2 master-at-arms who were clearly uncomfortable with the situation they'd been ordered to handle. Admiral Blackwood had turned his back on her, addressing the flight deck crew with instructions to resume operations under a replacement officer. That's when the emergency beacon started screaming. The sound cut through the tension like a knife, immediately shifting every person's focus from the drama they just witnessed to the crisis unfolding over their radios. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Seahawk 12. We are experiencing multiple system failures and are going down. GPS coordinates follow. Request immediate search and rescue assistance." From my intelligence station, I could see everything happening at once. Admiral Blackwood spinning around toward the communications array, Commander Mitchell rushing toward the flight deck control station, and maintenance crews scrambling to prep the search and rescue helicopter. But I also saw something else. The weather station displays showing wind speeds that had increased from 15 knots to nearly 30 in the past hour, with wave heights climbing to 12 feet. Seahawk 12 was a Navy helicopter carrying 4 crew members on a routine supply run between ships. According to their emergency transmission, they were 15 miles northeast of our position and losing altitude rapidly. Their main rotor was showing signs of catastrophic bearing failure, and they had maybe 3 minutes before they'd be forced into the water. The math was brutal and simple. Our SAR helicopter could reach them in time, but launching in these conditions was at the absolute edge of safe parameters. The window between wave sets for a successful launch was less than 4 seconds. Miss that timing by even a second, and the helicopter would hit the back of a wave on takeoff and crash into the ocean. Admiral Blackwood looked around the flight deck and realized something that made his face go pale. The officer he'd just assigned to replace Valentina was Lieutenant Carl Morrison, a competent officer with 18 months of carrier experience. But Morrison had never conducted a launch in conditions this severe. In fact, nobody currently on duty had the experience to pull this off except for one person. Commander Mitchell stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the deck. "Admiral, we need our most experienced flight deck officer for this launch. Lieutenant Morrison is good, but these conditions require someone who's done this before." Morrison himself spoke up, showing the kind of integrity that defines the best naval officers. "Sir, I've never launched in seas this rough. I don't have the experience to guarantee success." All eyes turned to Valentina, who was still standing between the 2 master-at-arms, technically under arrest for disobeying orders. Admiral Blackwood found himself facing an impossible choice. maintain his authority and risk losing 4 lives, or swallow his pride and ask the officer he just publicly humiliated to save the day. The radio crackled again with increasing desperation. Constellation Seahawk 12, we are at 200 feet and descending rapidly. Estimate 2 minutes before water impact. Please advise on search and rescue status. Valentina stepped forward, not waiting for permission. Admiral, I request permission to conduct the emergency launch. 4 lives are at stake, and I have the most experience with these sea conditions. For a moment that felt like an eternity, Admiral Blackwood stared at her. Around them, 60 flight deck crew members waited for his decision. Above them, I held my breath in the intelligence station. Behind them, the SAR helicopter crew sat ready to launch the moment they got the signal. Finally, Admiral Blackwood nodded grimly. Permission granted, Lieutenant, but understand this. Completing this mission doesn't change your status. You're still relieved of duty after this operation. Understood, sir, Valentina replied, already moving toward the flight deck control station. I just need to bring our people home. The moment Valentina stepped back into position at the flight deck control station, something remarkable happened that I'll never forget. Every single crew member on that deck, from the youngest airman to the most senior petty officers, moved with a precision and urgency I'd never seen before. These were people who had worked with my sister for 3 years, who trusted her judgment implicitly, and who understood that 4 lives hung in the balance. The conditions were absolutely brutal. The Constellation was pitching and rolling in 12-foot seas, with the deck rising and falling nearly 20 feet with each wave. 30-knot winds were gusting across the flight deck, strong enough to knock a person off balance if they weren't ready for it. The search and rescue helicopter, a massive MH-60S Seahawk, sat on the deck like a caged beast, rotors spinning, crew ready to launch the instant they got the signal. But here's what made this so dangerous. The timing window for launch was impossibly narrow. Between the wave sets, there was maybe a 3-second window where the deck would be level enough and the ship stable enough to safely launch a helicopter. Miss that window by even a second, and the aircraft would either hit the back of a rising wave or launch into a downdraft that would slam it into the ocean. Valentina positioned herself at the edge of the flight deck, directly in line with the helicopter's takeoff path. From my intelligence station, I could see her studying the wave patterns, calculating the ship's movement, reading the wind direction changes that were happening by the second. This wasn't just about timing anymore. This was about understanding the ocean itself and predicting its behavior. The radio crackled again with increasing desperation. Constellation Seahawk 12, we are at 50 feet and dropping fast. We can see the water. This is our last transmission before water impact. That's when my sister did something that demonstrated why she'd earned the respect of every person on that flight deck. Instead of rushing the launch, she waited. For 30 agonizing seconds, she stood perfectly still, watching the deck movement, feeling the ship's rhythm, calculating angles and vectors in her head while 4 people's lives hung in the balance. Admiral Blackwood started to speak, probably to tell her to launch immediately, but Commander Mitchell grabbed his arm and shook her head. She understood what Valentina was doing, and she knew better than to interrupt that level of concentration. Finally, Valentina raised her right hand. The entire ship seemed to hold its breath. The helicopter crew tensed in their cockpit, rotors at full power, ready to lift off the instant they got the signal. From the bridge to the engine room, everyone who could see or hear what was happening focused on that single raised hand. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 seconds, Valentina held that position. She was reading the wave pattern, timing the ship's movement, waiting for the perfect moment when everything aligned. Then, in one fluid motion that was both graceful and decisive, she pointed forward and dropped her hand. The helicopter launched flawlessly. I watched from above as it lifted off the deck with perfect timing, clearing the wave that was building behind the ship by less than 10 feet. Within seconds, it disappeared into the storm, racing toward the coordinates where Seahawk 12 was fighting for survival. The flight deck erupted in controlled chaos as everyone resumed their duties, but there was an electricity in the air that hadn't been there before. What we just witnessed wasn't just a successful launch. It was a masterclass in naval aviation conducted under conditions that would have challenged officers with twice Valentina's experience. 8 minutes later, the radio brought news that made everyone's efforts worthwhile. Constellation, this is SAR 1. We have visual contact with Seahawk 12. All 4 crew members are in the water but alive. Beginning rescue operations now. But the real moment came 30 minutes later, when Admiral Blackwood walked across the flight deck to where Valentina stood. Every person on that deck turned to watch their exchange, understanding that what happened next would define both of their careers and possibly change how the Navy handled situations like this forever. Admiral Blackwood's walk across that flight deck was the longest 30 seconds of his military career. Every step was measured, deliberate, and watched by hundreds of eyes. When he finally reached Valentina, who stood at attention despite everything that had happened, his first words surprised everyone within earshot. Lieutenant Reeves, in 28 years of naval service, I have never witnessed a more perfect launch execution under conditions that would challenge our most experienced officers. His voice carried clearly across the deck, and I could see crew members straining to hear every word. But more importantly, your earlier actions regarding that hydraulic leak have been vindicated. Maintenance has just confirmed that aircraft 307 would have suffered complete hydraulic failure within minutes of takeoff. The silence that followed was different from the tense quiet we'd experienced earlier. This was the sound of recognition, of understanding, of a moment that would be talked about in Navy wardrooms for years to come. I allowed the pressure of these exercises and my own pride to cloud my judgment, Admiral Blackwood continued. You did exactly what every naval officer should do when faced with an impossible choice. You put the safety of your crew and the integrity of your service above your own career advancement. Your flight deck certification is hereby fully restored, and I will be personally recommending you for the Navy Commendation Medal. But what happened next was even more powerful than the Admiral's public apology. The search and rescue helicopter returned with all 4 crew members from Seahawk 12, alive and uninjured. As they were brought aboard, each one made a point of finding Valentina on the flight deck. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, the helicopter's crew chief and a 20-year Navy veteran, shook her hand and said something that made her eyes well up with tears. "Ma'am, we heard what happened over the radio. We heard you put your career on the line to keep us safe, then risked everything again to save our shipmates. That's the kind of leadership this Navy needs." The story spread through the fleet faster than any official communication could travel. Within hours, sailors on every ship in the battle group knew about the officer who was demoted for doing the right thing, then proved her worth when lives were on the line. But the real impact went far beyond one day's drama. 6 months later, Valentina received that Navy Commendation Medal in a ceremony attended by officers from across the Pacific Fleet. The citation read, "For exceptional courage, professional competence, and unwavering commitment to safety in the face of significant personal and professional risk." But she told me the medal meant less to her than the new safety protocols that were implemented fleet-wide as a direct result of her actions. The Navy established new procedures ensuring that any safety concern raised by qualified personnel would be thoroughly investigated regardless of operational pressure. Junior officers were encouraged to speak up about safety issues without fear of retaliation, and a new review process was created to prevent the kind of corner cutting that had become routine during high-pressure exercises. 3 years later, Valentina became one of the youngest female executive officers in the Navy, but she never forgot the lesson of that day. In her stateroom aboard the USS Enterprise, where she now serves, she keeps a photo on her desk. It's not from her commendation ceremony or her promotion to executive officer. It's a picture of her flight deck crew from the Constellation, the people who trusted her even when their commanding officer didn't. That photo reminds her every day that real leadership isn't about rank, authority, or following orders blindly. It's about having the courage to do what's right when everyone else is too scared to act, and then being ready to prove your worth when people need you most. Today, when young officers ask Valentina about that day, she tells them something our father taught us both. Your integrity is the one thing nobody can take away from you unless you give it up voluntarily. Sometimes defending it costs everything you think you want, but it's always worth more than anything you might lose.